Prime Minister Scott Morrison throwing cold water over a report in the Australian newspaper one day earlier, which cited government sources saying his cabinet had approved recognition and was planning to announce the change in policy on Wednesday. During a news conference in South Australia's Adelaide, Morrison was asked about what decision had been made. The Prime Minister saying it was too soon to discuss the issue, telling reporters, "When I'm in a position to make that announcement, I will." Earlier I spoke with Vic Alhadeff, the CEO of the New South Wales Jewish Board of Deputies in Sydney. Take a listen. Now, what seems to be holding the Prime Minister back from making a decision that he hasn't, in fact, expressed support for a number of times?
In order to answer this question, Tracy, I'd like to put a little bit of context around it. 3 months ago, the former Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, was voted out of his office by his own party. As soon as that happened, he resigned from his seat, which meant there needed to be a by-election in his seat. And the two front runners in what was a wide field, both had direct relevance and interest to the Jewish community. One was Dave Sharma, former ambassador to Israel, and the other was Dr. Kieran Phelps, who was a former deputy mayor of Sydney, former president of the Australian Medical Association. And in fact, Dr. Kieran Phelps won, and in so doing became the first ever Jewish female member of the parliament. It was during that campaign that Prime Minister Scott Morrison announced that he may move Australia's embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. That is when the issue was put into the public debate right here. And so what is happening now, and to answer your question, is that there has been, Australia, like Israel, is a robust democracy. There's very robust debate. So on the one hand, on the one side, if you wish, we have the Defence Minister, Christopher Pyne. We have the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, who happens to be Jewish, by the way, Holocaust background, who are strongly in favour of Australia moving its embassy to Jerusalem and recognising Jerusalem or West Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Then in the centre, you have someone like Greg Sheridan, arguably the most informed journalist in the country on Israel, who's saying that every country which recognises Israel recognises that West Jerusalem is Israeli sovereign territory. Therefore, Australia should recognise West Jerusalem as the capital, but should not move the embassy because it's been reported to be costing up to $200 million to do that, and it's just not worth it. And then at the other side, we have fierce opposition to all of the above, and a report in just today's Sydney Morning Herald saying government bureaucrats, senior former government leaders advising the government not to do anything. So there is this robust debate happening, and what many commentators expect to happen, and this goes to answering your question, is that it may be a compromise down the middle, that the government will announce that it will recognise Jerusalem or West Jerusalem as Israel's capital, that it will not move the embassy because of this enormous cost, but that what it will do is set up an Australian consulate in Jerusalem. And it was just announced a couple of hours ago that the Prime Minister is going to address one of our leading think tanks called the Sydney Institute on Saturday, and it will be very surprising if he does not make the announcement then.
Now, Vic, of course, there has been accusation that, as you mentioned, that by-election, that Morrison was in fact pandering to Jewish voters. Does he need the Jewish vote? How do Jews vote in Australia? How much does policy towards Israel, in fact, play out at the ballot box?
Jews have been part of Australia since day one of non-Indigenous settlement going back 230 years. Having said that, we are only 0.05% of the population. I'm talking about 120,000 people out of 25 million. So we're a tiny dot. We make a lot of noise, but we're a tiny dot in terms of the body politic. Jews, there is no Jewish vote per se. This is not the United States. There's no Jewish vote per se here. Jews vote on a range of issues. The economy, the immigration debate is a big issue right now on the numbers of immigrants, refugee policy, and yes, of course, Israel policy does factor into it. But it is only one of a number of factors which come into how Jewish people vote. So it does not make sense that he would be pandering to any Jewish vote per se, because there is no Jewish vote. As I said, we are only 0.05% of the population.
All right, then I just want to talk through what's said to be at risk for Australia in making this decision. Of course, you mentioned just some. There are fears that the move could, in fact, threaten this landmark free trade agreement with Indonesia. And not only that, but here in this region, that it could spark violence again in the West Bank and Gaza, like we saw in the wake of the US decision. We've also heard from a senior Palestinian official, Saeb Erekat. He's calling on Arab and Muslim countries to sever ties with Australia if it changes its policy on Jerusalem. So why would a move like this be worth it to Scott Morrison?
I guess two answers there. The first one, like Josh Bryden, the treasurer of this country, made the point that it's like some of these threats are coming out of extremist organizations in Indonesia. One's called the 212 Brotherhood, the other's called the Islamic Defenders Front. Indonesia is a country, as is Malaysia, which refuses even to have diplomatic ties with Israel. And so countries like that should not be dictating foreign policy, or put it the other way, no country should accept dictates on their foreign policy from a third country, which is what those countries seem to be doing. Why is Australia doing this? A cynic once said that countries don't have friends, they have interests. If this happens, if this recognition happens, it will be because of moral clarity, it will be because of values, standing with friends, standing with allies. Just exactly 1 year ago, Tracy, thousands of Australians poured into Beersheba to commemorate the centenary of a major battle there waged by the Australian light horsemen to rescue Beersheba, to defeat the Turks and the Ottoman soldiers who were occupying that part of the country. A few years later, it was an Australian statesman, Dr. Everett at the United Nations, who was heading the commission which supported the partition plan, which then became accepted in 1947. It was that same Australian who was then President of the General Assembly when Israel was accepted as a member of the United Nations. And going forward, in recent years, Australia has been one of just 5 countries with the United States which have opposed resolution after resolution against Israel. And just last week, Australia opposed 6 resolutions which are anti-Israel, one of them denying the Jewish connection to Jerusalem. And Australia refused to be part of an attempt to airbrush out of history the 3,000-year Jewish connection to Jerusalem.
Sure, but sorry to interrupt you. Yeah, is what are the Australian interests then? If you're talking about this long-standing history and alliance that Australia has with Israel and all of these links, why now? Why is it worth it to Australia now?
What it is now is another link in a very strong chain which binds our two countries. It's about values, it's about moral clarity, it's about standing with your allies and standing with your friends. And if this does pass, if the Australia does recognize Jerusalem or West Jerusalem as Israel's capital, that is another very strong link in a very strong chain which binds our two countries. And that is, at the end of the day, what this is about. It's the right thing to do.
Just very briefly, Vic, I'd like you to put your Jewish Board of Deputies hat on. Of course, as you mentioned, it's not clear if the government intends to recognise the entirety of Jerusalem as the capital or just West Jerusalem. What's your take? What would such a move mean for Jews in Australia?
First of all, there's not been absolute clarity on whether, if it does take the step, whether it will be just West Jerusalem or all of Jerusalem. But what has been made clear at the time that this announcement was first made by the Prime Minister is that such a decision would not preclude East Jerusalem from being part of a future state of Palestine. In terms of what this would mean for the Jews of Australia, Australian Jewry comprises one of the most Zionistic communities in the diaspora. In terms of the funds going to care, and I saw it in terms of annual visits to Israel, Australia is per capita right there at the top of the world Jewish community. So for this move, it would signal to the Jewish community or remind the Jewish community or reinforce the fact that we are very fortunate to live in a country where the government is extremely supportive of Israel, where there is bipartisan support of Israel, going back since day one of Israel's creation and all the way back to 1917. And that's what it will reinforce to the Jewish community, that we are very fortunate to have governments on both sides of the aisle which stand alongside Israel and do the right thing when it comes to such issues.
Vic Alhadeff,